February 1945. The gates of Santo Tomas internment camp creaked open beneath the Philippine sun. Allied soldiers stepped cautiously inside, rifles raised, faces pale from disbelief. The courtyard was silent, lined with gaunt women in faded dresses, their eyes hollow but alert. They had waited 3 years for this moment. A young nurse, barely recognizable under dirt and starvation, stood among them. In her trembling hands, a soldier placed something small and fragile, a mirror. She stared, unsure at first what she was holding. When the glass caught the light, her own reflection blinked back. She gasped. Then her lips parted in shock. The face she saw wasn't the one she remembered. Hair gone gray, cheeks sunken, eyes enormous. Around her, the others clutched their mirrors like relics, some covering their mouths, others weeping silently. No one spoke. It wasn't vanity that stunned them. It was recognition, the sudden, brutal truth of having survived long enough to see themselves again. For the first time in years, they faced the one thing the war had stolen most completely, their own humanity. Before the mirrors, before the liberation, there were the years of darkness, years when time itself seemed to stop behind barbed wire. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, thousands of Western civilians were caught in territories suddenly consumed by the Japanese advance. Singapore fell in February 1942, Manila soon after. Entire colonies, the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, Malaya, collapsed in weeks. Among the captured were soldiers, missionaries, nurses, teachers, and wives. Many of them were women who had never seen battle, who had come to Asia for family, duty, or faith. For these women, captivity was not immediate horror, but a slow unraveling. In places like Changi Prison in Singapore, Santo Tomas and Los Baños in the Philippines, and Banduang in Java, they were herded into compounds meant for criminals or schools turned into internment camps. At first, the Japanese guards maintained an appearance of order. Prisoners were registered, searched, and confined. But soon as the war tightened and Japan's supply lines thinned, the veneer of civility vanished. The conditions deteriorated quickly. Food rations shrank to handfuls of rice and watery soup. Sanitation failed. Latrines overflowed. Tropical disease, dysentery, beriberi, malaria, spread through crowded barracks. In some camps, women died quietly in their bunks, covered with rags by the morning. But there was something subtler, something even more destructive than hunger. It was the loss of identity. In captivity, names faded into numbers. Women cut their hair short to fend off lice. Mirrors were forbidden, glass confiscated, metal polished, dull. There were no reflections, only memory. A nurse from the Netherlands later wrote, "I began to forget my own face. When I touched my skin, I imagined someone else's." The Japanese viewed female prisoners with a complicated mixture of disdain and curiosity. Under the Bushido Code, surrender was shameful. Yet these captives, particularly European women, were treated not as enemy combatants, but as symbols of a defeated West. Officers often called them hostages of empire. The guards' cruelty was sporadic but calculated. Humiliation instead of execution, deprivation instead of annihilation. In Santo Tomas University, once a thriving college in Manila, classrooms became dormitories for over 3,000 internees, men, women, and children. Desks turned into beds, blackboards into notice boards for the dead. A few nuns and teachers tried to maintain order, organizing lessons for children and dividing meager rations by age. In the evenings, the women whispered stories to keep the illusion of life. Farther south, in the Dutch East Indies, the situation was harsher. After the Japanese invasion of Java in March 1942, more than 100,000 Dutch civilians were interned, many of them women and children. They lived behind bamboo fences under constant surveillance. The guards referred to them as Boer women, a derogatory echo from older colonial rivalries. One internee, Wilhelmina Janssen, recalled in her diary, "We no longer had mirrors. We stopped caring what we looked like, because there was nothing left to look at. When you see the same walls every day, you forget the idea of a world beyond them. Without mirrors, they relied on each other's eyes. You look thinner became a measure of time. A fading face became a calendar. Yet among the horror there was order, a quiet, improvised resilience. Women organized kitchens, clinics, and even choirs. Former nurses treated the sick with boiled water and rags torn from old sheets. Teachers created lessons for children using charcoal and scraps of paper. They traded buttons, soap, or thread as currency. These acts, small and defiant, became their resistance. In Los Baños, a camp hidden in the lush hills outside Manila, more than 2,000 civilians lived under constant fear. They were guarded by a mix of Japanese soldiers and Filipino collaborators. By late 1944, with Japan's defeat approaching, conditions worsened drastically. Rations dropped to almost nothing. Some prisoners boiled grass or peeled bark from trees. Many collapsed from exhaustion while trying to work in the fields. Still, they endured. One British internee later said, "We did not live to eat. We ate to live just one more sunrise." By 1944, rumors of the advancing Allies began to circulate. American bombers roared overhead. Prisoners could sometimes see flashes of air raids far away. The Japanese guards grew more violent, more paranoid. They sensed their empire crumbling. In those final months, even the most basic human sensations had become foreign. The smell of soap, the warmth of clean sheets, the sight of one's reflection. Women had become unrecognizable to themselves. They measured time not in days but in bodies, and yet the camps also forged a kind of collective courage. Women protected each other fiercely. They hid the sick from roll calls to prevent punishment. They sang hymns quietly at night, voices thin but steady. In some camps, makeshift Christmas services were held, using candles made from tallow scraped from soup tins. One survivor recalled, "We celebrated not because we had faith in God, but because it reminded us we were still human." The Allied forces, meanwhile, were preparing for liberation. Intelligence units mapped the camps, while Filipino guerrillas passed secret messages through fences. The Japanese, fearing rebellion, began relocating or killing prisoners in some regions. At Los Baños, a massacre was imminent, until a daring rescue was launched. By early 1945, the Pacific War was reaching its brutal crescendo. Manila was burning, Japan's navy shattered, and American forces were advancing rapidly. Behind enemy lines, thousands of women waited, unaware that freedom was only days away. Their faces were skeletal, their voices faint, their sense of self dissolved into survival. They had long forgotten the curve of a cheek, the shape of their own smiles. When liberation finally came, it arrived with the sudden noise of gunfire and parachutes. It came with food, medicine, and light. And among the many gifts the Allied soldiers brought, after years of starvation, terror, and waiting, one was the simplest and the most shattering. A mirror. It would not only reflect faces, it would reveal what war had done to them, and what it had not destroyed. They had lived too long without mirrors, and when they finally saw themselves again, the shock was not vanity but revelation. For years in camps scattered across Asia, the women of Changi, Santo Tomas, Los Baños, and Bandueng had endured a slow erasure of self. What the enemy took was not only their freedom, but their sense of identity, a psychological captivity as profound as any physical cage. The war had stripped them of names, of possessions, of reflection. Inside those bamboo fences, a woman ceased to be someone. She became a number, a ration, a task. Their faces, once familiar, were reduced to faint memory, half-imagined outlines of who they once were before the world turned to ruin. In such places, the absence of mirrors became a kind of punishment. Without reflection, time dissolved, faces aged unseen, hair thinned and skin hollowed, but the mind still clung to the old image. Many women later said they felt as though they lived in two bodies, one remembered, one surviving. The remembered self, the young nurse from London, the mother from Batavia, the teacher from Manila, remained frozen in her last glimpse of normal life, while the surviving self, skeletal and weathered, belonged entirely to the camp. This dual existence defined the female POW experience in ways the outside world rarely understood. Unlike soldiers, they fought no battles. Their war was internal, fought in silence, fought with dignity, fought to remain human in a place designed to erase humanity. And yet even in that void, they built something extraordinary. They organized schools under the eyes of their captors, taught arithmetic to children using charcoal and broken tiles. Nurses turned rusted tin cans into sterilizers, sewing rags into bandages. Former housewives became leaders, administrators, surgeons, mediators. Where the Japanese guards saw weakness, they built strength. A Dutch internee later wrote, "We had no weapons, so we made rules. We had no supplies, so we made order. It was the only way to stay alive. Every task became an act of resistance, peeling potatoes, whispering prayers, sharing a scrap of bread. The women learned to live collectively, not as individuals. A single bar of soap could be shared by 10. A single secret could save many, and through this unity they preserved something sacred, dignity. But identity was harder to keep. Without mirrors, there was no continuity of self. Hair turned gray unnoticed, eyes dulled by disease, skin cracked and blistered. When new internees arrived, the old ones could barely recognize them. We saw them as we had once been, one British nurse recalled. Full cheeks, bright faces, they looked like ghosts of our past. Mirrors were forbidden because they gave prisoners power, a reminder of their own existence. The Japanese guards understood that, and so they denied reflection. The camp itself became the mirror. Every emaciated face reflected in another. They began to see themselves not as individuals, but as a collective reflection of endurance. When one woman collapsed, others carried her. When one wept, the others hummed to drown the sound. The human chain held. Psychologists later studied these camps as examples of identity deprivation, where the boundaries between self and environment disappear. Yet the women, without any training or theory, had intuitively learned to survive it. They replaced mirrors with memory. They remembered faces, not for vanity, but for proof that they once existed. They drew portraits in dirt, whispered each other's names like prayers. Even humor survived. A few women fashioned cosmetics from crushed bricks and soot, pretending to apply rouge before inspections. They called it camp theater. It was a joke, but also a rebellion, an insistence that womanhood, however reduced, could not be erased by uniforms or hunger. And within that female order, roles emerged. Some became caretakers, others record keepers. The nurses, especially in camps like Los Baños, became legends. They worked 18-hour days with no medicine, stitching wounds with boiled thread, crushing aspirin into dust to stretch its use. Death was constant, yet so was the instinct to heal. The will to nurture in the face of cruelty was itself a form of defiance. Japanese guards often underestimated them, assuming women would break first, but they didn't. When the men in nearby compounds began to despair, it was the women who smuggled notes of hope. When disease struck, it was the women who buried the dead, then washed their hands and went back to work. Outside the fences, the war shifted. Japan's empire stretched thin. The Americans advanced from island to island. Supply routes crumbled. Food grew scarcer for both captors and captives. In the camps, the women felt it before anyone else. They dug gardens in soil that barely produced roots. They collected rainwater in buckets, boiling it for hours. And when air raids thundered above, they prayed not for death, but for recognition, that someone still knew they existed. In Changi, a group of female prisoners secretly composed a vocal symphony, using only their voices to recreate the sound of instruments. They performed it in whispers during night roll calls, the harmonies barely audible beyond the walls. It was later written down by a survivor, Margaret Dryburgh, and became known as the captive choir. For many, it symbolized how the human spirit could persist without food, without freedom, even without mirrors. The Japanese command viewed such acts with suspicion. They feared order among prisoners, particularly women, whom they believed should remain passive. But in nearly every camp, authority structures formed organically. Women elected leaders, set work rosters, and negotiated with guards for better rations or medical care. It was civilization rebuilt from scraps. When one guard demanded that the women bow each time he entered, they did, but in silence, heads raised again with pride, eyes unbroken. Among themselves, they talked often about the past, the homes they might never see, the husbands lost, the children gone. They spoke softly at night, because speaking loudly felt dangerous even to their own memories. "We lived between worlds," one internee said. "We were alive, but already halfway to ghosts." Some began to forget words, songs, or birthdays. Others remembered everything obsessively to keep their minds from dissolving. The loss of reflection had become the loss of continuity. When liberation finally drew near in 1945, few dared to believe it. The bombing of Manila echoed faintly across the hills. Some said it was thunder. Then came rumors, American paratroopers, guerrilla raids, ships approaching. Hope returned cautiously, almost painfully. In the final weeks, as Japanese discipline collapsed, Guards grew erratic. Some vanished. Others turned crueler. The women slept in shifts, unsure whether death or freedom would come first. What none of them expected was the moment after. The moment when Allied soldiers, clean-fed, sunburned, stepped through the camp gates with their rifles and medkits. They brought food, medicine, blankets. They brought soap, brushes, and water. And then, in quiet gestures that would later become unforgettable, they handed out mirrors. For the soldiers, it was a simple kindness, a way for the rescued to wash, to see themselves again. But for the women, it was overwhelming. They had forgotten what faces looked like, what skin truly was. When they lifted the mirrors, the world seemed to stop. What they saw was not beauty or vanity. It was time that had passed unseen. Wrinkles, scars, gray hair, all of it proof that they had lived through something the human mind was never meant to witness. Some laughed through tears. Others could not bear to look. One American nurse wrote later, "It wasn't my face. It was someone older, someone who had watched everything die and still breathed." Yet in that reflection was something sacred. Survival. Beneath the hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, they saw endurance. They had outlasted their captors, outlasted disease, outlasted silence. And in that realization, the mirror became not an object, but a monument, a reminder that humanity, however fragile, endures even in absence. That moment of seeing oneself again was both the end and the beginning. It marked the threshold between captivity and freedom, between forgetting and remembering. And as the war's final days unfolded, those mirrors glinted like small pieces of truth scattered through the ruins of empire. The final months of the Pacific War were chaos incarnate. By early 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing under relentless Allied assault. The Philippines, once hailed by Tokyo as an impregnable bastion, had become a battlefield of desperation. Manila burned under artillery fire. Villages vanished in flame. In the forest beyond, guerrillas struck convoys at night, vanishing before sunrise. And deep behind those shifting front lines, the female prisoners of Los Baños internment camp waited, fragile, skeletal, yet still alive. For them, the war's end felt both near and impossible. They had heard the distant thunder of bombs, seen the trails of aircraft passing overhead, even smelled smoke drifting from distant battles, but inside their fences time remained stagnant. Hunger gnawed daily. Rice rations had fallen to less than half a cup per person. The Japanese guards, short on supplies and nerves, had grown unpredictable, sometimes indifferent, sometimes violent. A few prisoners whispered rumors that the guards planned to execute them before retreating. It was not paranoia. It was history repeating itself. Massacres at Palawan and Borneo had already proven the pattern. In that perilous moment, liberation took shape not through chance, but through precision. The plan to rescue the internees of Los Baños was one of the most daring operations of the war. A coordinated strike involving the U.S. 11th Airborne Division, Filipino guerrillas, and amphibious units crossing Laguna de Bay. Their intelligence came from the very people the Japanese thought powerless: local civilians, escaped prisoners, and Filipino scouts who risked their lives smuggling information through jungle and swamp. On February 23, 1945, the mission began before dawn. The air was heavy with mist. Paratroopers assembled in the darkness, loading rifles and folding maps. Across the lake, Filipino boatmen waited in silence, hands resting on oars. It was not just a rescue. It was a race against time. The Japanese garrison near the camp was growing restless, and the order to kill all prisoners could come at any moment. Inside Los Baños, the prisoners knew nothing. That morning, they gathered for roll call as usual, weak and shivering, unaware that within an hour the sky would open. Among them were hundreds of women, teachers, nurses, mothers, some so malnourished they could barely stand. They had lived like this for 3 years. They expected nothing. Then, at precisely 7 a.m., the world changed. Out of the clouds, C-47 transport planes appeared, engines roaring low. Parachutes burst open against the pale blue, hundreds of them. For a heartbeat, the prisoners froze, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Then someone screamed, "Americans!" The camp erupted. Women clutched each other, some crying, some laughing hysterically. On the ground, the first paratroopers landed within yards of the fences, firing bursts at the guard towers. Filipino guerrillas charged from the tree line, their rifles flashing in the sunlight. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Within minutes, the battle raged across the compound, on the gunfire, shouts, the clang of boots on tin. Prisoners hid behind barracks praying. For the women who had survived years of silence, the sound of Allied voices, sharp American accents shouting orders, felt like the first real sound of life. It was chaos, yet strangely beautiful. Liberation had come not quietly, but with the sound of freedom itself. In less than 30 minutes, it was over. The Japanese guards were dead or captured. The gates were smashed open. Trucks and amphibious vehicles arrived through the jungle paths carrying food and medics. The paratroopers shouted to the prisoners to gather, but few could walk. Most were too weak, their limbs trembling from starvation. Soldiers lifted them in their arms, carrying them out like children. And among the first supplies unloaded from those vehicles were boxes of medical kits, soap, bandages, and mirrors. Small hand mirrors, the kind issued in personal care sets for nurses and relief workers. They were distributed almost thoughtlessly at first, a simple gesture of hygiene, part of the effort to restore order. But what happened next stopped everyone. A corporal handed one of the mirrors to a woman sitting in the shade of a Quonset hut. She took it hesitantly, as if unsure what it was. When the light caught its surface, her own reflection blinked back. A hollow face, eyes enormous, skin stretched thin over bone. She gasped, then covered her mouth. Nearby, another woman dropped her mirror, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Some began to cry. Some stared blankly, unable to process it. Others laughed, a raw, trembling laughter that sounded almost painful. A nurse from the camp later wrote in her diary, "We had forgotten what we looked like. When the glass showed us our faces, it was as though we met strangers who had lived our lives for us." The paratroopers didn't understand at first. They thought the women were frightened by the reflection of their malnutrition. But it was more than that. It was the realization that they had survived long enough to see themselves again, that they existed beyond the number on a roll call. For years they had been shadows. Now they were human once more. Photographers who arrived hours later captured the aftermath. In those black and white images, one sees the women gathered near the camp's broken fences holding small mirrors, faces tilted toward the light. Some are weeping. Some are smiling faintly. Behind them, paratroopers rest on their helmets, watching quietly. There is no posing, no grandeur, and only quiet disbelief. The scene would later become one of the most haunting symbols of liberation in the Pacific. By mid-afternoon, the evacuation began. Boats ferried the rescued civilians across the lake toward safety. The women were given food, water, and blankets. For many, even the smell of soap brought tears. They bathed for the first time in years. When medical officers examined them, some weighed less than 70 pounds. Others were blind from vitamin deficiency or crippled by infection. But every single one who could still move insisted on washing, on brushing their hair, on reclaiming some fragment of themselves. Elsewhere in the Pacific, similar scenes played out. At Santo Tomas, Changi, and Banduang, liberation came in waves, not always with paratroopers, but with doctors, nurses, and soldiers carrying supplies and cameras. They documented everything. In some places, prisoners sang hymns as Allied flags were raised. In others, they stood silent, watching their captors surrender. But in every camp, the pattern was the same: disbelief, tears, and the quiet rediscovery of identity. At Santo Tomas, an American relief worker recalled handing a mirror to a middle-aged British woman. She touched her cheek, looked at me, and whispered, "I thought I'd died years ago." That moment, repeated hundreds of times across Asia, captured something that statistics never could. The liberation of female POWs was not just a military success. It was a psychological resurrection. The Allied press quickly seized on the images. Photographs of emaciated women holding mirrors or smiling through tears appeared in newspapers around the world. To the public, they symbolized both the cruelty of Japanese captivity and the endurance of Western womanhood. But to the women themselves, it was simpler. It was proof that they had endured, that they were no longer invisible. Not all rescues ended cleanly. Some camps, like those deep in Sumatra or Borneo, were liberated too late. Starvation and disease had already claimed hundreds. Survivors from those regions later described how mirrors became sacred objects in post-liberation hospitals. Nurses would place one beside each patient's bed as a gesture of restoration. It reminded us one survivor said, that we were still people, not patients. For Allied soldiers, many of whom had never seen female POWs before, the experience left an indelible mark. They wrote about it in letters and diaries, how the women, despite years of horror, retained grace and gratitude. One American sergeant wrote, "They thanked us for things as small as soap or a comb. But the mirrors, those broke them. I think that was the moment they really believed they were free." As the trucks rolled away from Los Baños, the women looked back at the camp, the barbed wire, the watchtowers, the smoke from burned buildings. Some wept quietly, others whispered prayers. They were leaving behind the place that had nearly consumed them, but also the place that had forged their strength. And within the chaos of evacuation, a few carried their mirrors with them, clutching them like talismans. They didn't look again immediately. Some waited days or weeks. For many, it took months to face the reflection without tears. By the time the last survivors reached medical stations in Manila, news of the rescue had spread worldwide. Newspapers called it one of the most perfectly executed missions of the Pacific War. But to those who had lived it, perfection had little meaning. What mattered was that the gates had opened, and the mirrors had returned what war had taken away: the human face of survival. In the black and white footage from those days, you can still see it. The raw emotion, the confusion, the relief. Women wrapped in blankets, children clinging to them, medics guiding them into trucks, and among them, flashes of light reflecting from small pieces of glass, each one catching the sun for a moment as if the earth itself was remembering them. The war was ending. Japan would soon surrender, but for the women of the camps, liberation did not mean peace. It meant beginning the long journey of becoming whole again, of learning to live with the face that stared back from the mirror. When the rescue operations ended and the guns went silent, the women were finally free. But freedom at first felt strange, almost unreal. The world outside the barbed wire was loud, bright, and unrecognizable. The sudden abundance of sound and color overwhelmed them. For years they had lived in shades of gray, the color of dust, hunger, and exhaustion. Now the sight of the sea, the blue of the sky, and the laughter of the soldiers felt almost painful. Many couldn't sleep for nights after liberation. The silence of captivity had been replaced by the hum of airplanes, the crackle of radios, and the distant echoes of rebuilding. For the first time in years, they could breathe without fear. Yet that freedom came with an unexpected weight: the confrontation with what remained of themselves. Medical officers in Manila and Leyte recorded the same scenes across every field hospital. Emaciated women wrapped in clean sheets, trembling as they touched soap and warm water. Some weighed less than 70 pounds. Others were so weak they had to be spoon-fed. Their skin was paper-thin, their hair brittle, their eyes sunk deep with malnutrition. Doctors noted cases of beriberi, scurvy, malaria, and severe anemia. Yet what struck them most wasn't physical. It was the emotional silence. Many of the women spoke little. They ate slowly, methodically, as though expecting the food to disappear. They smiled politely when handed mirrors, but some turned them face down on the bed. One nurse described it as the quiet of disbelief, like people still expecting the guard's whistle. In the first days after rescue, the women were moved to temporary recovery camps run by the Red Cross and U.S. Army medical units. Photographs taken there show rows of white tents under the tropical sun, stretchers lined in the sand, and soldiers kneeling beside women too frail to stand. The nurses who tended them, many of them veterans of frontline hospitals, later said that caring for these survivors was unlike anything they had seen before. They looked older than their mothers, one said, but spoke like children who'd forgotten how the world worked. As days turned into weeks, strength began to return. Hair was washed and trimmed. Clean uniforms replaced the rags of captivity. With nourishment came faint color to their faces, and with it emotion, tears, laughter, even embarrassment. For some, the first time seeing their reflection clearly was harder than any moment in the camp. They realized just how deeply time had altered them. A Dutch woman at Bandung wrote in her journal, "The mirror was my final captor. I wanted to smash it, but I also couldn't stop looking." Many survivors wrote later that the true liberation was not stepping through the camp gates, but being able to recognize themselves again. "It took months," said one British missionary, "before I saw my face and thought, yes, that is me." Others described moments of guilt, that they had lived while friends had not. The act of looking into a mirror became a quiet ritual of remembrance. By mid-1945, ships began repatriating survivors to Australia, Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. The journeys home were long and surreal. They sailed past the same waters that had once carried them into war, now lined with wrecked ships and rusting debris. For many, the voyage felt suspended between two worlds, the living and the lost. Some still hid food in their blankets at night. Others woke in terror thinking they were back in the camp. When they finally reached their homelands, the homecomings were bittersweet. Families greeted them with tears, parades, and news cameras, but few could truly understand what they had endured. They were heroes to the public, but within they carried something more complex, a mixture of pride, trauma, and alienation. Civilization had moved on while they had been frozen in captivity. Shops were open, radios played music, and newspapers spoke of victory and peace. Yet the women who had lived through years of starvation and silence found these things strangely distant. Many spoke of feeling invisible again, not from imprisonment this time, but from misunderstanding. In a world eager to celebrate victory, few wanted to hear about the long years of degradation, disease, and fear that women had survived. Their suffering did not fit neatly into the heroic narrative of war. It was too domestic, too quiet, too haunting. People wanted stories of soldiers, one survivor said, not of women who simply endured. Still, some refused silence. Agnes Newton Keith, an American writer imprisoned in Borneo, published Three Came Home in 1947, a memoir that would become one of the first public accounts of female internment under Japan. Her descriptions of starvation, humiliation, and human endurance struck a chord worldwide. In the Netherlands, Wilhelmina Janssen and others gave testimony to post-war tribunals, describing the brutality of the camps in Java. Their voices, long suppressed, became part of the record that exposed the human cost of the Japanese occupation. The war crimes trials that followed Japan's surrender brought a measure of justice, but also revived trauma. Survivors were asked to testify against their captors, reliving the very acts they wished to forget. Some refused, choosing peace over vengeance. Others demanded acknowledgement. "We could not fight with guns," said one Dutch internee, "so our testimony was our weapon." Yet recognition came slowly. In post-war societies dominated by stories of male heroism, the ordeal of women in the Pacific remained a shadowed subject. For decades, their suffering was remembered quietly, within families and small veteran circles. Only in the 1980s and 1990s did historians begin to revisit their stories, uncovering diaries, letters, and photographs long hidden in attics and archives. These personal accounts revealed not only the horror of imprisonment, but the extraordinary resilience that defined it. Psychologists studying trauma later described the mirror as a profound metaphor for recovery. To see oneself after long deprivation is to re-enter time, to reclaim continuity. For these women, that process took years. Some developed chronic illnesses. Others became advocates for peace, dedicating their lives to education and reconciliation. Many, especially in the Netherlands and Australia, returned to Asia decades later, visiting the ruins of camps where they had suffered, standing silently where their younger selves had once starved. In the Philippines, memorials were built at Los Baños and Santo Tomas. Visitors can still see fragments of foundations, rusted fences, and the outlines of barracks. At Changi Prison in Singapore, a museum preserves the drawings, songs, and makeshift artifacts created by women during their imprisonment. One of its exhibits, simple and understated, features a small hand mirror recovered from the camp after liberation. Its surface cracked, its handle worn smooth. Beneath it, a plaque reads, "The first reflection after captivity." That phrase captures everything. The mirror, once forbidden, became a symbol not of vanity, but of survival. For the women who lived through those years, it marked the moment they stepped back into existence. Looking at themselves again was not easy. It was painful, even terrifying, but it was real. It was proof that they had endured the unendurable and still carried the capacity to feel. Over time, their stories began to reshape the historical understanding of World War II. It was no longer just a tale of armies and empires, but of endurance in the most personal sense. The female prisoners' quiet heroism expanded the meaning of courage, showing that survival, too, is a form of victory. Many of them never fully recovered their health, Some died within a few years of liberation from diseases born in captivity. Others lived long lives, raising families, writing books, attending reunions. When asked how they endured, their answers were simple. We had each other. That solidarity, formed in hunger and despair, remained unbroken long after the war. Survivors wrote to one another across continents, sending small packages and photographs. A few carried their old camp mirrors into old age, keeping them on bedside tables or tucked inside drawers, not as ornaments, but as reminders. The legacy of their endurance echoed far beyond their generation. In later wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Balkans, humanitarian workers invoked their story as proof that the civilian, and especially the female, experience of war mattered as deeply as any battlefield triumph. The lesson they left was both tragic and luminous, that dignity can survive even when the world around it collapses. The women who had once been too weak to lift a spoon eventually found the strength to face their reflections. In doing so, they gave the world a new image of courage, and not in uniform, not in glory, but in endurance. The mirrors they once feared became emblems of truth, reflecting not only faces but the long, silent victory of survival itself. And in the quiet rooms of old age, as the years passed and the wars faded into history, some of them still paused before a looking glass in the morning light. They saw wrinkles where once there were scars, calm where once there was hunger. The reflection no longer frightened them. It reminded them of who they were, and that they had lived to see the face of freedom. In the end, their story is not one of war but of rediscovery. The mirror, that simple piece of glass, became a symbol of something far deeper than reflection. It was a quiet reckoning with the self, a fragile reunion between memory and survival. After years of seeing only death, starvation, and the faces of others in despair, the women finally saw the face that had endured it all. That moment, repeated across dozens of camps and hospitals, remains one of the most human in the entire war. No speeches, no flags, no fanfare, just the soft sound of breath, the tremor of hands, the flicker of light across tired eyes. History is full of battles that ended empires, but it is in these small, silent resurrections that the true cost and triumph of humanity can be seen. For these women, the mirror became both truth and forgiveness. It showed the years lost, the faces changed, the innocence stripped away. Yet within those hollow cheeks and silvered strands there was something extraordinary, endurance without hatred. Many of them chose not to speak of vengeance but of resilience, of the quiet strength that arises when everything else is taken. Decades later, when survivors were asked what liberation meant, they did not speak of soldiers or flags. They spoke of soap, of sunlight, of mirrors, of looking into their own eyes and recognizing the person who had waited in silence through years of hunger and fear. Their reflections tell us what history often forgets: that war is not only destruction, but transformation, that even in the darkest places the human spirit seeks to see itself again. And so, somewhere in a museum glass case, one mirror still rests, its surface scratched, its handle worn smooth by trembling hands. It does not show a face anymore, only the faint light of the world around it. But that is enough, because in that small fragment of reflection lives the memory of every woman who looked into it and finally saw that she had survived.